Good morning and welcome to everybody, and thank you for the over-generous introduction. It's my pleasure and privilege to be here with us celebrating 25 years of ATREE. Coincidentally, as we know, it's 75 years of Indian independence and 50 years after the first Stockholm Conference on the human environment. So it's a very nice coincidence, I think, that we are here celebrating all these three things in a sense, because I don't think ATREE would be possible in colonial India. I think the Stockholm Conference was a trigger for many activities and moves on focusing on the environment. And I think ATREE was one of the, one can say, fallouts of the churning that happened because of the Stockholm Conference. And ATREE's journey, we have heard a little bit of it just in the previous session. It's a fascinating journey. And what I'm going to do actually in the next 45 minutes that I have at my disposal, I was given a very difficult task of talking about how exactly we have done the bridging of disciplines and bridging of roles, as the jargon goes, interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary research. And I thought I'd take the same stories that you've already heard in the morning or you've seen through the movie. You'll probably hear much more outside on the videos, in the videos and the various things that are available about ATREE, and stylize it a little bit to lead you through certain bridgings, certain transformations, certain expansions that I think have happened in the way we think and the way we function, which has all led to where we are today. So it's a bird's eye view really to share with you and to celebrate this evolution of ATREE, to look back and reflect on what can we learn from that in terms of what has been our mission and how well have we achieved it, what might be some of the pitfalls or the bottlenecks, and use that to flag directions and challenges for the next 25 years. So I think Asmita talked about the next 5 years. I'd like to make a pitch for us to think more broadly for the next 25 years in terms of how we are going to pull off the next stage of the evolution of ATREE. I have some caveats, of course, to say that this is going to be very, very broad brush. It is simply impossible in this kind of a presentation. I think Ravikant did a much better job in terms of giving you a bird's eye view of the various things that ATREE has done in the pieces. What I'm going to do is more stringing them together in a story. So in making up a story, I have to let go of a lot of the details. So it's very broad brush. It's going to be linear storytelling in what is obviously a non-linear world. We haven't actually evolved in this kind of very nice linear fashion. We have meandered, we have, as Professor Bauer said, we have fought, we have quarreled, we have sometimes gone around in circles, and 25 years later, sometimes I wonder whether we are back to where we were in 1996. So it's telling you a linear story of what is obviously not a very linear evolution. And I'm going to use constantly the word we, how we evolved, how we did, how we changed, how we rethought, how we re-examined, but there is no one we. It's a collection of individuals which has also changed over time, holding the whole thing together, of course, the Board of Trustees, but there's been a lot of churning and a lot of different people that have contributed, and not necessarily that all the different people are on the same page, as Professor Bava and the other trustees mentioned. We're not even today necessarily all on the same page. So there's going to be this very stylized we in my narrative, because we can afford to gloss over the differences at least for a day. So in the class that I teach at ATREE, which I have helped co-develop with Gladwin actually, who's here, and Nitin Rai, on interdisciplinarity, I start the first session in the class by asking this question: why are you here? So this is a question addressed to PhD students and more recently to the master's students in the ATREE programs, whether it's a sustainability studies program or the conservation practice program. Why are you here? And I give them 4 options. I want to solve society's environmental problems. I want to generate knowledge that will help solve society's environmental problems, a somewhat more modest goal. I enjoy generating knowledge for its own sake, but hope that it will also solve some societal problems, an even more modest goal. And more frankly, I enjoy generating knowledge for its own sake, and environment just happens to provide interesting puzzles to solve. So these are the 4 options provided, and it's very interesting to see the distribution of hands that are raised for different options. Which one do you subscribe to? And we get the whole spread amongst the students, including some who very honestly say, well, I really enjoy doing ecology, and I mean, frankly, I'm here to just get a PhD in ecology, and if something useful comes out of it, fine. Otherwise, it's also fine. So I think we get the whole range. When we started the ATREE PhD program over the years, I think we have built a certain image that has also helped us define who or select who we get. We could ask the same questions, set of questions, or the same question with the same options for ATREE as an organization. So why is ATREE here? As an organization that talks about sustainability and that talks about conservation, why is ATREE here? And we could say, well, we are here because we want to solve society's environmental problems, which would be a very different kind of organization if you want to actually go and solve the problems that are out there. We could say that we want to generate knowledge that will help solve society's environmental problems. We could say that we want to generate knowledge for its own sake and hope that it might solve a few problems, as a bonus. Or we might want to generate knowledge for its own sake, and the environment just happens to be an interesting arena in which to do this curiosity science. I think if we were to ask for a raising of hands 25 years ago, we might have gotten all 4 possible answers to this question, why we are here. Over the years, I think we have coalesced a little bit more in terms of trying to figure out why are we actually here, what is our mission. We've oscillated between the 1, 2, and 3. 1 being doing everything to solve environmental problems. Some of it is because of fuzzy thinking. I think some of it is because we ourselves want to do everything. We just don't want to only publish papers. We want to feel that we are part of change in the real world. A lot of it has to do with donors who want us to do everything. And very often they want us to do number 1, which is go out and change the world, and not really worry about knowledge production. That kind of can take a backseat as far as the donors are concerned. So we get all kinds of pressures from outside and pressures from inside in terms of the kinds of answers we give to that question of why we are here. And so we have oscillated between 1, 2, and 3. I think we have not generally gone to 4 saying we only do curiosity science for its own sake and we don't really worry about the benefits that might come out of it. But I think over this last 25 years, it would be fair to say that we have converged to a significant extent on number 2, that we want to be producing knowledge for change. And that's a really important part of the evolution of an organization, to have clarity about what it's trying to do. But then that raises a whole bunch of questions. If you want to produce knowledge for change, what kind of change do we want? What is good change and what is bad change? What is a good society that we are aiming for? What is our definition of a good society? What kind of knowledge would best contribute to such a change? That becomes your next question, obviously. And then how can we produce that kind of knowledge? Is there one particular way of producing this knowledge? Is there a pathway that's already been given, or we have to find our own way? And how will this knowledge that we produce somewhere in our offices or in our minds or in our papers and so on actually lead to change in the real world? What's the pathway between knowledge and impact? And of course, the sort of procedural question as to who makes these choices, who makes these decisions about how we are going to answer these questions that come with the mission of producing knowledge for change. So to sort of show you how we have answered these questions and how they lead us to in the direction of inter and transdisciplinarity, I'm going to tell you 2 stylized stories. One using a thread which is very old in ATREE. It is, in a sense, as Professor Bava Umashankaran Ganesha said, it precedes ATREE, is work in the forests of BR Hills, and the work that started around forests, and the thread is very thick thread in ATREE's tapestry in some sense. And the other, which is work on water, which started a little bit later, but has also become a fairly significant amount of the work that ATREE does. So the first story about forests, we started with the idea that the change that we want is biodiversity conservation. What we really want is biodiversity conservation. And to do that, we need to produce knowledge, and the knowledge that we need is basically good biology. Because there are a lot of gaps in our understanding of biodiversity that we're talking about saving and so on. Therefore, what we need to save biodiversity is good biology. And we have actually over the last 25 years contributed a huge amount of good biology in this direction of sort of biodiversity conservation. We have climbed trees and studied the diversity in tree canopies. We have discovered species of frogs. We have not only discovered new wasps, but named them after ATREE. We have distinguished between different species of amla out in the BRL's forests. But this raised more questions than it answered, because the next question was, what is causing biodiversity decline? And clearly, the biodiversity decline that we are seeing is largely anthropogenic. So the question is, we need to understand, is that decline happening for all species? What is the nature or the rate of decline? So the question of sustainability of non-timber forest product extraction, for instance, the dynamics of invasives that threaten biodiversity, possibly it's not the extraction, but it's the lantana that's spreading through the forest. Understanding the genetics of medicinal plants to figure out what's actually going on, and can we use this technology or this particular tool to figure out the fate of these medicinal plants as they go through the economy. So we applied our science to study gooseberry and honey harvest. We applied our science to actually demonstrate that lantana was indeed spreading rapidly across the BRL's landscape and other landscapes subsequently, and that the removal of lantana could make a big impact in terms of the reproduction of the native tree species, grasses, and so on. And we've applied DNA fingerprinting technology to actually trace the movement of medicinal plant drugs, and to demonstrate that 80% of the trade samples of medicinal plants that we tested were actually fraudulent. So the medicine industry, Ayurvedic industry, that is dependent upon high quality raw materials from these from the biodiversity of our country, is actually being taken for a ride, and therefore also the consumer of those health products. And that's something really important that the DNA fingerprinting methodology has shown. So in a sense, we have made one bridging already here. We have bridged from a descriptive science which talked about the diversity, the number of species, the new species that we were discovering, and so on, to a more problem-driven science saying, if there is a decline, why is there a decline? So working backwards from the problem rather than only forwards from a descriptive sort of perspective. But the next question then, of course, is, why do harvesters cause unsustainable harvest, or not uproot lantana on their own, for that matter? And so we had to ask questions like, is it the income from the NTFPs? If they're actually getting low income, why are they getting low income? Is it because they have somehow lost their customary institutions of managing the forest? And so we looked at for example, the economics of Tendupata, which is a very important non-timber forest product in central India. And we saw that the difference between what the government was selling the product at the final stage, which is the upper graph, and what the collectors were getting, which is the lower graph, and this is data for Orissa state. So there's the massive gap, the amount that the government is swiping in between the pluckers getting their wage and the government getting the final price in the name of royalties, taxes, and so on. So clearly one of the reasons for low income is the fact that our institutions set up for supposedly tribal development are not functioning the way they are supposed to function. We worked on the mapping of sacred sites with community participation in BRLs, and we produced maps which showed their customary boundaries around their podus, around their traditional settlements, which have actually now been obliterated. What you see in this map doesn't exist, in the sense that most of those settlements have been resettled, quote unquote, by the forest department in particular clusters, and therefore these traditional institutions of managing the forests in these particular patches in their own ways have been lost. So we have now made the second bridging, which is from a relevant ecology, which is looking at the problem and answering the ecological questions that arise as to why there is decline of NTFPs. From an ecological perspective, we have moved into the question of why is human behavior leading to that kind of decline, or those kinds of harvesting practices or forest management practices. We started with the use of economics, it was easy to also go to anthropology because a lot of biologists get attracted, for example, to ethnobiology and the documentation of traditional knowledge. But we have expanded to include disciplines like institutions and political science, which tell us that the tragedy of the commons is the product of certain kinds of arrangements of rules around natural resources. And we have critiqued, therefore, the rules that have been created under the so-called Joint Forest Management Program, and a deeper investigation through the discipline of political ecology. Whose forest is it anyway? So the question of rights and the question of customary tenure on these forests, the question of colonial conquest and the consequences that colonial conquest had and continues to have for the forests of India today. In doing all this, we also started questioning our starting assumption. We started with the assumption that a good outcome is increases in biodiversity. But fairly soon we realized that this is a very deep ecology perspective that is ignoring many other ways of understanding or setting the ethical goals for whatever we are trying to do here. And so we defined our goal as socially just conservation. Initially, we used the word people-friendly conservation, and I think over time we have more explicitly embraced the idea that it has to be socially just conservation. And so in this becomes the third bridging, which is the bridging between science, social science, and philosophy and ethics, where we are questioning the goals that we are setting ourselves to achieve. But in the process, then we encounter more questions. So for example, what if social justice or livelihood enhancement goals clash with the goal of conservation? What do we do in that context? And so we had to embrace other kinds of ethical principles, such as the idea of democratizing forest governance or democratizing environmental governance, democratizing all decision making around natural resources as the only solution to resolving these conflicts, and not a conflict resolution methodology dictated from the top, either by a political class or by a technocratic kind of elite. We asked further questions about can we make this happen? So we talked all this theory about, we need to change some things in order to achieve conservation, or for that matter, socially just conservation. Can we make it happen? So we were in parallel experimenting with enterprise-based conservation. In fact, the enterprise-based conservation experiment in BR Hills again precedes the formal formation of ATREE. But that has continued to be an important strain or an important thread in ATREE's work, which is to do action research of this kind, working with local communities for livelihood enhancement and conservation simultaneously, but going beyond enterprises to look at questions of rights and therefore enabling forest rights recognition and trying to work towards rights-based forest management, among other things, in many parts of the country now, not just in southern Karnataka, but also in central India and so on. So this has been part of the action research thread of ATREE's work. So moving from conventional research, the fourth bridging in a sense, moving from conventional research to action research, and of course policy dissemination, or even you would say policy advocacy, in order to make that change actually happen. It's important for us to keep in mind the action research that we are talking about is an iterative process where you pilot something and then learn from that in order to correct perhaps the prescriptions or the ideas that you had come up with in order to have an improved model to disseminate in a sense. And the policy work similarly is about synthesizing what you know, recommending, helping implement, analyzing the results of implementation, and then again kind of running through the cycle. So that's the forest story, kind of trying to capture these bridgings that happened, starting with more descriptive science and ending up in action research. And we see a similar story in the water context. We began the water work one step ahead, in the sense we began with an applied perspective in our science. Our science was problem-driven right from beginning, whether it was applied hydrology or pollution science. And we defined for that particular work, the change that we wanted was that we need clean water. For human consumption, for agriculture, for animals, we need clean water. And so we started with that pollution science. And this work on the impact of Kudremukh iron ore mining on the water quality of Bhadra River was done at least 15 years ago in the Kudremukh landscape, and demonstrated the impact that iron ore mining was actually having. We moved to Bangalore city and looked at heavy metal pollution in the Vrishabhavati river. And in this case, we not only saw the problem and did the hard work as the person wading through the dirty water sort of exemplifies, of collecting the data, identifying the sources and partitioning the contributions from different sources that were putting heavy metal in the water, but then going one step further and analyzing pollution laws, analyzing the monitoring and enforcement mechanisms of the Pollution Control Board and the governance of the Pollution Control Board in order to arrive at recommendations that go beyond just the biophysical side of the story. We further expanded the waterworks, of course, straddles not just the water pollution side of the story, but also the water resource side of the story. So we have an expanded set of goals for the water sector, which are adequacy and affordability, of course, quality and environmental flows, equity and social justice, sustainability and resilience, and democratic governance as the sort of five-fold normative concerns for any kind of work that you might want to do in the water sector. And these goals were captured in the draft water policy that ATREE contributed very significantly to the Karnataka Knowledge Commission's work in drafting in 2019. And of course, we worked very hard for policy dissemination and impact in the water sector. Fascinatingly, the Kudremukh iron ore work contributed to the shutdown of Kudremukh mine. So that was probably being in the right place at the right time. We sort of tipped over the arguments and the mine was shut down. The heavy metal work was presented to the Pollution Control Board and has led to the setting up of a committee. Now we all know what that means. Usually setting up of committees are ways in which to delay and divert attention. So we can still hope for the best, but not necessarily hold our breath. And the work that we did on the comprehensive water policy for the state of Karnataka is still sitting on shelves and unlikely to see light of day from whatever I hear. In fact, I just heard that they already approved a very watered down version of that policy document. There are many such storylines, and there's a whole set of videos out there on screens that will demonstrate these storylines. It will show you that we have varying levels and combinations of disciplinary and interdisciplinary work and crossings and bridgings from across disciplines and across the science policy and science action divide. And that ATREE has really exemplified this effort to make these connections, not remain a conservation biology organization, but to become an interdisciplinary, as Ravikant said, not only interdisciplinary research organization, but an academic think tank which is also engaged with the grassroots and policy levels at the same time. And so I would not want to do injustice to all the different threads that are out there that are running through our work, but I'll just say watch those videos outside. But one bridging that is missing from the ones I described so far is the bridging from research to training and teaching. And in that, we have basically launched a PhD program in conservation science and sustainability studies in 2008. We've more recently launched the MSc program in conservation practice. We've, of course, been doing a very large number of training programs for water engineers, foresters, students, journalists, over the last 25 years, and simultaneously trying to build capacity at the local levels on biodiversity monitoring, on forest rights, forest management, water monitoring, and so on. And that work continues to be an integral part of our training programs and feeding off the research at the same time. So to summarize these bridgings or expansions from descriptive science to problem-driven science, from only looking at ecological processes to the underlying behavioral, economic, and social causality, from conventional research, academic-style research, to action research and policy engagement, from a focus on conservation to a broader understanding or a broader goal of sustainability, justice, and livelihoods, and therefore in the process sectorally expanding our work from biodiversity to other environmental issues, for instance water, and a little bit of work on climate change and so on. And of course, from only knowledge production to the work of knowledge transmission, which is training the future generation of knowledge producers. I've told you stylized stories, and of course you will see that these crossings, if you look very closely, are fitful in space and in time. They are idiosyncratic. Some people believe in them, some people less so. They are incomplete by all means. There's a lot more work that we can do in terms of making these bridgings stronger and deeper. But they have taken us in a certain direction. And the direction that have taken us is captured in our mission statement, which I've chopped up to sort of show you the sequence. ATREE's mission is to generate knowledge, but the knowledge is for achieving environmental conservation. The knowledge needs to be rigorous and interdisciplinary. It's not just environmental conservation, but also sustainable development in a socially just manner. And then to enable the use of this knowledge by policy and by larger society, and to train the next generation of scholars and leaders. So that's our mission statement, and as you can see, the different parts match the different crossings that I've tried to describe in terms of what ATREE has been trying to do over the last 25 years. So now comes the question. What have we learned from this, and what should we be thinking of in terms of the next 25 years going forward? And I'd just like to present a few ideas. As Kamal said, we are argumentative Indians, so those questions, those ideas are bound to create some amount of discomfort, and I hope that's our role, is to pull people out of their comfort zones. So the first recommendation I have is actually simple, that we need to remain true to our knowledge mission. As I said right in the beginning, if you asked us what we are or why we are here, we have wavered between trying to be a grassroots organization which actually implements activities for their own sake, to being a sort of a more basic science organization. And I think we need to have clarity on our mission, or we have clarity, we need to stick with that clarity and not get pulled and yanked by the different forces outside and different predilections inside in terms of moving away from that core mission. And that core mission has to be to continue to invest in rigorous, long-term, salient biophysical science, bring back rigorous social science into our work. I think we've lost a number of social scientists over the last few years. That's, I think, a very big loss, given that we already had a small number to begin with. We need to expand our engagement not just with the sciences and the social sciences, but with the engineering and technology sector, because I think that's where a lot of change is happening. That's also responsible for where we are today, including both the benefits and the downsides of modernization. And our policy inputs need to be based on our interdisciplinary research. We should not be separating the research from the work that we do in the policy space. It needs to be iterative and interactive. And we must always remember that critique is important. Today we live in a certain world that is intolerant of critique. We are told that we must only look for win-win solutions, that what we must say is only what is palatable to the powers that be. But the role of knowledge producers is to speak truth to power. And truth can sometimes be, or very often, can be uncomfortable, if not downright, a source of a huge amount of discomfort. So I think we cannot forget the first and foremost thing, which is the nature of our mission, which is to produce interdisciplinary, rigorous knowledge, which speaks to these questions that are extremely urgent, more urgent today, 25 years later, than when we started, in some sense. Second, I think in doing so, we need to, in a sense, remember that we embraced a plural set of values. We moved on from biodiversity conservation as a narrow goal. So we cannot just talk about conservation. We cannot just talk about socially just conservation. We need to be talking about sustainable and equitable development. And I think that is a jump that we have made in words, but not necessarily always in deeds, because we come from certain backgrounds, and we are weighed down by our backgrounds, we are weighed down by our training, and that keeps us in a certain location and slows down our expansion in this embrace of a broader societal goal, which is of sustainable and equitable development. And I'd like to sort of show this pictograph as a way of capturing these ideas of sustainable and equitable development, which is human well-being, along with non-human well-being, equity and justice, sustainability and resilience, and a democratic process through which we actually reconcile these obviously goals that are in tension with each other. And therefore, we have to watch out for both the conscious and the unconscious slippages that happen. I was making sure that I had the right mission statement, the statement that I showed you earlier. So I went to the ATREE website, and lo and behold, the word socially just has disappeared from the ATREE website mission statement. Now, I'm very confident that this is an inadvertent lapse, but it shows that given the forces that are out there, why would this particular word go missing of all the words that are there in the mission statement? It reminds me that when I wrote the paper on sustainable development, that the phrase was originally coined as sustainable and equitable development, and eventually the Brundtland Commission decided to just shorten it to sustainable development. And there is a certain politics, there is a certain choice of values that are being foregrounded and values that are being backgrounded in this whole process of changing words. And I think even if it's unconscious, we have to watch out for unconscious slippages, for Freudian slips that might be happening, that might be revealing our own kind of biases and our own kind of predilections in these difficult times. Thirdly, and I think this is going to be the most controversial statement, going forward, I think we need to rise above a biocentric or a biotic-centric worldview. It's not biocentric, but a biotic-centric. And what I mean by this is that biodiversity loss is not the biggest environmental problem out there. It is an environmental problem. It's a serious environmental problem. It's probably not the biggest environmental problem that's out there. Some people call climate change the mother of all environmental problems. Others in the developing country context might say that even before climate change, we have been hammered by many other environmental problems, whether it is submergence due to big dams, displacement due to mining, or the disappearance of groundwater in Bangalore district itself, let alone 2,000 feet groundwater in Kolar and so on and so forth. So we have many environmental problems, and biodiversity loss is not necessarily the biggest environmental problem out there. And more importantly, biodiversity conservation will not solve this larger environmental crisis. We'd like to think that biodiversity conservation will not only conserve biodiversity for its own sake, but also lead to well-being, will also lead to this, that, and the other. But I think we are kidding ourselves if we think that that's actually the way we'll solve the larger environmental crisis. And similarly, in today's world, nature-based solutions has become a very popular phrase. It's biologists trying to, again, make themselves look very useful in this larger context, if I may caricature the story a little bit. And I think we have to really watch out, because nature-based solutions is easy. Tree planting is the easiest nature-based solution that's going around, and every school kid knows that the solution to all environmental problems is to plant trees, because that's the kind of pseudoscience that we are spreading. I don't mean the we here in this room, but certainly the we in the larger Indian and global context. And so nature-based solutions is as much of a fake news or pseudoscience that we need to watch out from, because it's part of this idea that biological conservation will actually solve a lot of these other problems. And finally, I'd like to say that we cannot save biodiversity out there while living an unsustainable lifestyle back here. That contradiction is not only an internal contradiction in our own minds. All human beings live with contradictions, so we might live with that same contradiction as we go through the next 25 years individually. But societally, this contradiction will never get resolved unless we confront it head on. We cannot sidestep this contradiction. The fact that the people who live closest to the biodiversity are the people who are the most deprived and marginalized in this country and in the world in general. And that contradiction cannot be resolved only by saying, well, fine, we'll do some enterprises to get them out of poverty, and that will somehow resolve the contradiction. Because we need to understand that social justice is not just about pulling people out of poverty just over the threshold, while the rest of the country is at 10 times or 100 times those incomes. It is about actually addressing questions of equity and justice, because it's the rest of the country or the rest of the world, the global north, as they say. Global north here means not just OECD countries, But people living the OECD lifestyle even in India are part of the global north. It's the global north which is reducing the environmental space that is available to everybody else. It is impinging upon everybody else's, the global south's well-being by producing the kind of pollutions here and now that is actually being faced by people who live in the coal mining belt of central India or who are submerged under dams that produce electricity that goes to Delhi, Bombay or Bangalore. So I think we need to be really aware of this contradiction and move out of a biocentric worldview. What I've shown you on the left, sorry, oops, on the right hand side is a more elaborate framework that points out that the development that we have had over the last 150 to 300 years under the name of modernization is a particular kind of shift from a dependence on biotic resources to a dependence on abiotic resources, whether it is fossil fuels, iron ore, manganese, bauxite, sand, and so on. And that shift we need to understand. We cannot close our eyes to that shift. We cannot sell a story which says that human well-being comes from ecosystem services. No, increasingly human well-being over the last 300 years, and we are seeing it right around us, whether it's the lights, whether it's the roof, whether it's the seats that we are sitting in, or the technology that we are all using. We are in the Institute of Science, which is not only science but also engineering, and it's that engineering science which has changed the world for good and for bad in the last 300 years. And that engineering science is about the abiotic, and we cannot run away from it, we cannot close our eyes to it. We need to embrace that challenge of saying how do we do a better engineering, a better technology as a part of building a better society. And therefore, this means that we're going to have to expand the second E of ATREE. Talking about Freudian slips, I noticed that Ganesha said, Ashoka Trust for Research in Ecology and Evolution. So, again, it's a Freudian slip, but what we need to be is replace that evolution with environment, which is in the name, and expand the work on environment beyond ecology, beyond conservation, in a sense, go beyond the green and engage with the brown questions. Questions of GHG emissions, air pollution, the energy that drives all of this, the industry and the development process that drives all of these pollution and biodiversity loss kind of processes. And therefore, we need to understand the structure of the abiotic economy. The big economy that we live in today is an abiotic economy, and capitalism has co-evolved with that abiotic economy. The structure of the state, which is bureaucratic and centralizing, also enabled by this kind of an abiotic economy. The values and lifestyles that this abiotic economy promotes, which are values of consumerism, the nature of modern knowledge, its fragmentation, its reductionism, and also its technological possibilism, its belief that technology will solve all the problems. And we have to co-create, and here co-creation means working with all the communities that we work at the grassroots. Co-create with them alternative structures bottom up. Because I think we would be fooling ourselves if we thought that by speaking the right words into the ears of policymakers, we will achieve impact on scale and solve problems. We will only achieve that marginal impact for which the policymaker was ready anyway. And they just wanted to hear the right words to legitimize their decision in most cases. And the real change will only come bottom up by empowering communities to demand and to visualize that new world that we are talking about. And so going forward, I think our action research should not be just research and action, where we do things in parallel, but it must be organically linked. It's not about implementation at scale, it's about piloting and learning from it. Therefore, we need to do the research, do the action, reflect on what we find when we do the action, and then iterate in some sense. And to do that reflection, we need time. We need a learning mindset, not just a doing mindset. And the impact at scale, as I said, will happen only horizontally. When other people pick up our pilot experiments, not by we implementing that at scale either. We becoming a mega NGO which replaces the state departments and does watershed development or does some other kinds of massive, multi-crore programs. That is not the way that real change is actually going to happen. That is just ephemeral change. And finally, going forward, we need to practice what we preach. We need to be not only a sustainable organization. I think we have taken already many steps, and I want to thank the organizers, my colleagues in the organizing committee who have sweated over this question of how do we reduce the footprint of this particular conference. But in the long run, over the next 25 years, we have to continuously work. It's always a work in progress to become a just, a participatory, and a caring organization. And finally, which is perhaps the most challenging for academics who are brought up in the idea of single-authored and first-authored publications, and I'm part of that community, we need to be mission-centric and not individual-centric.